For me, speaking truth to power is about having the courage to speak the truth, even if those in authority will be hostile to what you say, and even if they will engage in reprisals against you. And there's many historical examples of people who have spoken truth to power at great personal cost to themselves. But I want to focus on contemporary Australia to highlight a corrosive trend that's affecting our democracy and how it impacts on those like Gillian who speak truth to power. A few years back at the Human Rights Law Centre, we embarked on a project which we called, modestly, our Safeguarding Democracy project. This was a project that was premised on the fact that our democracy doesn't start and end on election day. Rather, the health of our democracy relies on some very important foundations, like the ability of civil society, of NGOs, charities, community groups to speak up about the work that they do. It relies on our press freedom. It relies on our rights to gather together and speak out and protest about the issues that we care about as communities. It relies on the rule of law, and it relies on the role of the courts and other institutions like the Human Rights Commission to hold government accountable. And when we looked at these issues and when we talked to colleagues across civil society, we really saw an unmistakable trend of governments, both at the federal and state level, of undermining these vital foundations. I'll speak a bit more on NGO advocacy because I know Misha is going to talk about the media. When you look at the NGO sector, it's absolutely vital to the health of our democracy that charities and community groups are freely able to speak up about the work we do, whether that's running a community legal centre, running a family violence service, running a homelessness service, or defending the environment. Yet we've seen governments at state and territory level using a range of different levers to make it hard for NGOs to speak up about their work, and governments intimidating NGOs when they do speak up in a way that is uncomfortable for government or where it criticises government. The Abbott government in particular in 2013 and 2014 engaged in a range of targeted funding cuts against organisations that spoke up, and this was particularly in the refugee sector, in the environment sector, but also for peak bodies in the Indigenous sector, homelessness, disability and the like. At the same time, it changed funding agreements to stop the funding of advocacy and to remove clauses that had explicitly said you are able to advocate. And this sent a message from government in a climate where organisations were having their funding cut and were worried about their sustainability and their staff. It sent a message that we don't value advocacy, and if you do advocate in a way that makes us uncomfortable, then your organisation is threatened. The Newman government in Queensland went further, and it had explicit gag clauses in funding agreements with community organisations that said, where an organisation receives half or more of its funding from the Queensland government, it must not advocate for state or federal legislative change. So even if you're a family violence organisation seeing the court system not work properly, seeing the legal system not work properly, you must not speak up about what you see. You weren't even allowed to include a link on your website to other organisations that might advocate for policy change. These aren't the actions of a government that's confident in its own policies or comfortable with a robust debate informed by a diversity of voices and perspectives, and that's exactly what charities like Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre, like other charities, bring to bear on public debates about laws and policies, the perspectives of the people that we work with. Even when organisations weren't funded by government, the federal government was looking to use levers to put pressure on them. We have charitable tax status, we rely on donations, people get a tax deduction for donations made to us, many environmental organisations in the same category. The government was attempting to say that if you advocate as an environmental organisation, your deductible gift recipient status, your charity tax status was threatened, and they said you should be planting trees essentially, not advocating to stop the pollution going into the river in the first place, which as we know is a far more effective way of protecting the environment. More recently, we've seen the appointment of a new commissioner of the charities regulator who has made statements which are very hostile to charity advocacy. And we've seen these so-called foreign influence laws proposed in the federal parliament, and we have spent a year of absolute hard slog trying to get these laws fixed. I'm pleased to say that the version that is going through the Senate today is a far cry from the version that was introduced last December into the Parliament, but that was a very deliberate attempt to stifle advocacy, to stifle criticism by charities, by community groups that made life uncomfortable for government. The cumulative impact of all these changes and the funding cuts on our sector has been profound. We did a survey with Pro Bono Australia and Melbourne University of the non-for-profit sector that showed 92% of respondents agreed that economic power and strong vested interests are the main drivers of government policy. 69% agreed that dissenting organisations risk having their funding cut. 53% agreed that NGOs are pressured to amend public statements in line with government policy. And it's why it's so critical for organisations like ours that speak up in ways and litigate and sue the government that we get independent funding, because that is a guarantee of our independence, and the government can't cut our funding. But like I said, there are different ways, different levers governments use to try and pressure NGOs to suppress their criticism of government, particularly in the environment sector. Just on press freedom, we've seen a real intensification of secrecy. We've seen the border force laws, ASIO laws, special intelligence operation laws that threaten journalists and others that talk about these operations with 5 or 10 years jail. We've seen the introduction of metadata laws that allow the government to expose confidential sources of stories that might embarrass government, and we've seen those laws used against journalists and their sources who've exposed stories around the treatment of asylum seekers and the way that boat turnbacks have infringed international law and boundaries. And we've seen the awful prosecution of witness Kay and Bernard Collaery for their role in exposing the illegal bugging of the East Timorese Cabinet Office at a time, by the Australian Spy Agency, at a time when Australia was negotiating oil and gas revenue with East Timor. And so to thank them for their role in exposing that kind of misconduct, we've seen them now prosecuted with a risk of up to 2 years jail if that prosecution succeeds. I'll wrap up. Attacks on protest rights, attacks on institutions like the Commission, attacks on the rule of law. Maybe just to finalise, for me, speaking truth to power isn't necessarily about exposing the truth to government and those in power. Really, they know the truth. I saw Noam Chomsky said power knows the truth already and is busy concealing it. For me, speaking truth to power is about exposing the truth to the public. Because when you look at issues like the treatment of refugees and people seeking asylum, the government is doing that in ways which are deliberately secretive, which are deliberately locking people up on offshore islands far away from the rule of law, far away from journalists, far away from human rights advocates. And the change that Gillian's remarked on has been the result of years and years of hard work by many individuals and many organisations to break open cracks in that regime, to show people the human faces of the people who are subject to this regime, the men on Manus, the kids and their families on Nauru, the babies who were born in Australian hospitals, whose faces we put on the papers and in the media when they were at risk of being sent back to Nauru. So for me, it is the power of those voices, those faces and those stories which are so absolutely critical to standing up for human rights. And thanks to Lord Campaspe and Arc Justice for putting on this show tonight, for putting on this talk tonight, because it really provides an opportunity for all of us to stand together and resist these attempts to prevent the Australian public from hearing about these kinds of issues. Thank you.